Imagine walking through an ancient sacred city where only a select few were allowed to traverse the inner corridors of the temples. Most remained outside, waiting for interpretations, never truly grasping the essence of what was being said or shown. Behind the stone columns and the words recited in languages few understood lay a sophisticated hidden system, a carefully constructed architecture of silence designed to protect or perhaps conceal the true power of spiritual knowledge. Since the dawn of organized civilizations, an invisible line has separated knowing from feeling, the external from the internal, the people from the essence. And those who wove this line did so with a clear intention: to ensure that only a specific elite had access to what truly liberates, transforms, and connects us to the primordial source. For millennia, sacred knowledge has been treated as private property. It wasn't a collective right, but a privilege granted to a select few, often connected by blood, political power, or rigorous spiritual initiation. This practice didn't begin with the major religions we know today. It dates back much further, among Sumerian priests, Egyptian magicians, Indian rishis, and Atlantean initiates, as some esoteric texts daringly suggest. Spirituality, though inherently a part of the human experience, has been shrouded in symbolic veils and safeguarded by codes, as if it were too dangerous to be in the hands of the masses, and in a way, it was. True spiritual knowledge is not passive. It awakens, liberates, and transforms. In a society built on control, nothing is more threatening than an awakened spirit. Behind the scenes of history, what we can call the order of the sacred behind the scenes emerged. Decision-making groups, centers of power, invisible councils that determined what the public should or shouldn't know about the nature of the soul, the cosmos, and their own inner power. We're not just talking about religious leaders or kings. These were true guardians of symbolism, internal alchemy, and the natural laws hidden beneath myths and legends. These groups didn't just preserve knowledge, they shaped it, cut it, and distorted it until its final form served more as a tool for control than as a bridge to the divine. Everything was meticulously calculated, from what was said in ceremonies to which stories would be told or silenced. Over time, these decisions have created a chain of spiritual disconnection. Humanity has shifted from being a part of the whole to becoming sinners reliant on intermediaries. The original symbolism that pointed to inner awakening has been twisted into external idolatry. The wisdom of the serpent, once a symbol of knowledge in ancient mysteries, has been reduced to a symbol of temptation. The goddess, representing the divine feminine and intuition, has been suppressed, diminished, and destroyed. This was no accident. It was the result of deliberate choices made by those who understood that controlling spirituality meant controlling the minds, bodies, and economies of the people. But the question remains, why go to such lengths to hide what could set us free? The answer lies in the relationship between power and awareness. The more aware an individual is of their true nature, the less susceptible they become to manipulation. An awakened being does not bow to fear, does not follow out of obligation, and does not get lost in promises of future rewards. They live in the moment, guided by a natural ethics and an inner freedom. This is the real threat to any system built on a hierarchy of fear. Thus, behind the robes of high priests and the crowns of kings, there existed a silent agreement to keep humanity on the outskirts of the sacred, nourished by fragments, incomplete metaphors, and dogmas that prevent a deep dive into truth. This hidden order was neither visible nor recorded in ordinary books. It revealed itself through secret synods, nighttime meetings, and pacts sealed in manuscripts that rarely reached the public. When enlightening texts surfaced, like many found in Nag Hammadi or the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were hidden away, burned, or labeled as heresy. Even when fragments of this knowledge managed to survive, they were interpreted through a preconditioned lens, diminishing their impact and distorting their meaning. It was akin to allowing a candle to be lit in a room already flooded with false spotlights, making its flame seem trivial. Meanwhile, the people remained estranged from themselves. They worshipped what was outside, neglecting what resided within. They feared what should have been explored and rejected what could heal them. Unbeknownst to them, they were perpetuating their own spiritual exile. The powers behind the scenes no longer needed to intervene forcefully. The system operated on its own, propped up by ignorance that had been carefully nurtured over generations. When someone dared to awaken and question, they were swiftly labeled a heretic, witch, madman, or rebel. The fear of ostracism and punishment served as a powerful shield for this invisible order, keeping countless minds asleep in the name of faith. However, there have always been cracks in that wall, small glimpses of light. People who, even without direct access to sacred knowledge, felt it within themselves. They were healers, mystics, poets, wanderers, shamans, and solitary seekers who, guided by intuition, touched upon truths that challenged established structures. They were deemed dangerous not because they possessed secret books, but because they lived vibrant truths. And a truth that is lived, unlike one that is imposed, is contagious. Thus, despite all the efforts of the powers that be, the human spirit continued to pulse, seeking, questioning, and awakening. This prompts us to reflect. How many of the beliefs we hold today are a result of this historical engineering? How many layers of veils still obscure our true understanding of the sacred? As we delve into this narrative throughout the video, we will peel back these layers with both firmness and respect, but also with courage and a thirst for clarity. Because what has been hidden often still resonates in the subtext of history, in overlooked symbols, in concealed texts, and most importantly, in ourselves. And perhaps, just perhaps, by understanding who decided what we should never know, we can also grasp what we were meant to remember, not as rebels against faith, but as mindful guardians of what is truly divine, a sacredness that requires no walls or hierarchies because it lives and resonates within every being that dares to awaken. In the early days of great civilizations, when humanity began to carve its observations of the stars and the depths of the soul into stone, a form of architecture emerged that transcended mere shelter: the temples. These sacred spaces were not just places of worship. They were living libraries filled with symbols, geometries, sounds, and rituals meticulously designed to preserve and convey spiritual knowledge. However, access to this wisdom was far from universal. From the outset, these sites were surrounded by layers of taboos, rules, and filters. The common people saw only the surface, the exterior, while the initiated were granted access to the core, the hidden essence of the ceremonies. The walls of the temples did not shield against physical threats, but rather protected against uninvited eyes. Those who crossed their inner thresholds were carefully selected, trained, and often bound by vows of eternal silence. In Egyptian temples, for instance, each room represented a stage in the soul's inner journey. Hieroglyphs and images on the walls told stories that were not merely mythological, but served as spiritual maps. An untrained eye might see gods with animal heads, an initiated one would perceive cosmic representations of the inner workings of human consciousness. The language was intentionally coded. A similar phenomenon occurred in the Vedic traditions of India, where mantras functioned as both mathematical and spiritual formulas. The sound was not just sound, it was a creative vibration. However, these mantras were preserved by specific castes, and their recitation was forbidden to anyone deemed impure according to the scriptures. Thus, knowledge was not only sacred, it was segregated, reserved, and elitist. This process of separation also solidified through translations. Language, a powerful bridge between minds and worlds, became a barrier instead. As ancient knowledge was transcribed into new languages, part of its essence was lost or deliberately altered. Words that once carried multiple meanings began to be translated with rigidity and literalism. Terms like logos, Sophia, ruach, and kundalini lost their mystical layers when rendered into languages that couldn't capture their depth. Partial translations, manipulated or filtered through political and religious agendas, created distortions that redefined the spirituality of entire cultures. The pursuit of truth shifted from being a quest to something that was managed. Taboos served as powerful tools in this process. From dietary restrictions to dress codes and sexual behavior, everything functioned as a system of control, tied to the purity required to access the divine. Breaking these rules meant not only being excluded from the temple, but also being branded as impure, unworthy, or dangerous. What should have been a personal and inclusive spiritual journey turned into a landscape of exclusion. Those who dared to reinterpret symbols, challenge dogmas, or question religious authorities were silenced, exiled, or executed. Over time, the fear of desecrating the sacred replaced the desire to understand it. The quest for truth was sacrificed in favor of obedience to ritual. The realm of the sacred extended into the arts. Paintings, music, dances, and stories were imbued with spiritual codes. In Mesoamerican civilizations, for instance, the ritual ball game symbolized the struggle between light and shadow, spirit and matter. In Greek theaters, plays depicted archetypes from the collective unconscious. Everything was interconnected. Yet once again, access to the true meaning was limited. The Eleusinian mysteries, Orphic teachings, and Dionysian rites all required initiation, oaths, and separation from the profane. The spiritual and intellectual elite distanced themselves from the masses, who were left with only diluted fragments, disconnected from the original transcendent experience. As empires expanded and conquered new territories, temples were often seized, destroyed, or repurposed. In the process of domination, one of the first steps was to suppress centers of spiritual knowledge. Burning libraries, erasing inscriptions, killing priests, and replacing idols were common tactics. The conqueror aimed not just for physical control, but for spiritual dominance as well. The imposition of new gods and rituals, often accompanied by distorted translations of ancient texts, served to sever the transmission of ancestral wisdom. What was once vibrant became dogma. What was once freedom turned into rule. Interestingly, the religions that emerged during this transitional period inherited this logic of exclusivity. In early Christianity, for instance, there were heated debates about who had the authority to interpret the scriptures. Over time, the church established itself as the sole legitimate interpreter. The populace, largely illiterate and forbidden from reading the Bible, had no choice but to accept what was preached from the pulpits. Translations into local languages were banned for centuries. This marked the peak of linguistic control over the divine. The Word, which according to the scriptures became flesh, was confined to Latin. The light was reduced to technical language, and the sacred was obscured behind clerical titles and rigid doctrines. Another essential mechanism was the use of symbols, which, despite being visible, have become unintelligible over time. The cross, the chalice, the eye, the serpent, the labyrinth, the mandala, all universal symbols found in various cultures that express transcendent ideas, have been reinterpreted, distorted, or stripped of their meaning. The serpent, once a symbol of renewal and wisdom, has transformed into an embodiment of evil. The chalice, a metaphor for the receptive feminine and hidden knowledge, has reduced to a mere ritual object. The eye, which once represented a state of awakened consciousness, is now associated with the surveillance of control. The decontextualization of these symbols has allowed them to be used against their original meanings. The sacredness of language has also suffered from the domestication of the mystical. In many ancient texts, such as the Vedas, the Tao Te Ching, the Hermetic writings, and even the original Hebrew Psalms, the language was poetic, metaphorical, and open. It was designed to provoke altered states of consciousness. However, the need for control demanded rigidity. Poetry became mere rules. Myth transformed into chronology. Metaphor turned into commandment. When you try to confine the infinite within a frame, something always spills over. And in this case, what spilled over was institutionalized ignorance. Few realized that what was taught to them at the altars was merely a pale shadow of what had been conveyed in the ancient temples. Translations of sacred texts, often carried out by monastic orders, have undergone ideological filtering. Some words were softened while others were omitted entirely. The translators were not merely linguists, they were theologians with clear agendas. For instance, terms that referred to inner divinity, unity with the cosmos, or the awakening of consciousness were replaced with words that emphasized fear, sin, and dependence on external authority. The same text, in different hands, could become either a key to liberation or a chain of domination. Thus, translation became a powerful weapon, not for enlightenment, but for blindness. Gradually, the illusion took hold that the sacred was difficult, unattainable, and too complex for the average person. Centuries of catechesis and spiritual colonization reinforced these taboos. Even today, many people carry the fear of questioning doctrines, reading on their own, or seeking answers within rather than outside themselves. This is the invisible legacy of temples surrounded by walls, a heritage of spiritual passivity. It's not about denying the beauty of rituals or the value of traditions, but about recognizing how, over time, they have been shaped to keep knowledge confined. But even the thickest walls are not eternal. Cracks began to appear when fearless seekers chose to return to the sources, learn ancient languages, decipher symbols, and study manuscripts forgotten in dusty libraries. In these fragments, they uncovered something powerful. Spirituality was never meant to be a secret, but an experience. What was confined within walls still pulses in the margins of texts, in ancient corners, and in misunderstood myths. The key lies not just in reading with the eyes, but with an awakened heart. For no matter how hard they try to hide the light, it will always find a crack to shine through. Behind the imposing walls of temples and beyond the veils imposed by languages, taboos, and corrupted symbols, there existed an even deeper layer of concealment. Those who decided behind the scenes what would be revealed and what would remain in the shadows. These were not merely visible priests or kings wielding golden scepters. They formed what we might call an invisible council, a spiritual and political elite that, throughout the ages, has shaped the collective consciousness of humanity without ever signing their work. Their influence was not confined to a single empire, religion, or era. They operated across time, connecting lineages, traditions, secret societies, and networks of intercontinental influence. The architects of mystery did not seek to be remembered. They wanted their decisions to feel natural, unquestionable, and eternal. This council was made up of initiates, men, and occasionally women, who had been trained from an early age in hidden codes, the sciences of the spirit, cosmic mathematics, and the manipulation of human archetypes. They mastered the secrets of astrology, sacred geometry, sound vibration, natural cycles, and the influence of words and images on the mind. They understood that what is whispered in a symbol can resonate for generations. They were experts in spiritual and psychic engineering. With this mastery, they took on the self-imposed responsibility of deciding what humanity could or could not know. However, they did not act out of ignorance or superficial malice. Many genuinely believed they were protecting the world from itself, keeping chaos in check and carefully regulating the light so that it wouldn't blind the unprepared. The work of these architects went beyond empires and institutions. While kings waged wars and nations changed names, the members of these orders remained steadfast. Some donned sacred robes, while others wore simple tunics. Some were found at altars, others in secret libraries or behind the scenes of government. Their influence seeped into political decisions, the editing of sacred texts, the founding of religions, and the burning of manuscripts. The church, for instance, wasn't built solely on faith. It was shaped through extensive theological debates held by councils that determined which gospels would be considered canonical and which would be dismissed as apocryphal. These councils often included men educated in Greek philosophical traditions, blending theology with political strategy. Faith was merely a veneer. The structure was meticulously crafted. These invisible councils organized themselves into initiatory networks that, despite changing names and forms, maintained the same purpose: control over knowledge. From the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece to the priestly colleges of Egypt, from the Essenes in the desert to the Pythagorean schools, and from the medieval guilds of scribes to the Rosicrucians and Freemasons, each inherited fragments of the same agenda: to conceal the power of consciousness, sharing it only with those deemed worthy. This wasn't mere selfishness. It reflected a hierarchical view of the spiritual world, where access to the divine was seen as a climb rather than an inherent right. Thus, the invisible council perpetuated the notion that only a select few were prepared, while the rest should remain in protective ignorance. The manipulation of knowledge was subtly woven into the very fabric of traditions. The council understood that it wasn't enough to simply hide books. They needed to shape language, redefine symbols, alter calendars, and tame myths. In Egypt, for instance, the mysteries of Isis and Osiris were not just stories. They were keys to the soul's journey of death and rebirth. However, when Greek influence permeated Egyptian temples, many of these myths were reinterpreted through a rationalist lens, stripping them of their transformative power. The same fate befell the teachings of Zoroaster, the Vedic hymns, Taoism, and Hermetic texts. The tradition wasn't destroyed, it was diluted, reshaped to serve the interests of those who viewed spiritual knowledge as a means of enduring power. Many of these architects left no names behind, yet their actions continue to resonate today. They determined which symbols would be celebrated, which words would be deemed sacred, and which sins would be unforgivable. They established dogmas that became unquestionable truths for millennia. They decided that the body would be seen as an enemy, that women should be silenced, and that salvation would always lie outside, never within. They defined what would be considered a miracle, heresy, holiness, and hell. They created artificial categories that shaped the collective imagination, turning human beings into servants of ideas. In doing so, they constructed an invisible prison, without bars, but with spiritual rules so rigid that they are still followed with fear today. These invisible advisors also served as editors of history. Many genuine spiritual events were rewritten or reinterpreted to suit the interests of the time. Prophets who spoke of spiritual autonomy were turned into symbols of submission. Masters who preached about the divine within were canonized as unreachable beings. Texts that taught the path of direct experience were transformed into rigid commandments. Gnosis, the direct knowledge of the divine, was condemned as heresy. Intuition was mocked, and the sacred feminine was purged from the texts. All of this was done with surgical precision, the result of decisions made in meetings that left no records but left deep marks on the collective unconscious. There was also a system of communication among the members of these orders. Knowledge wasn't just spoken or written, it was conveyed through symbols, gestures, numbers, architectural structures, and building patterns. Gothic cathedrals, for instance, were not merely churches. They were stone books, filled with hermetic codes for those who could decipher them. The arrangement of stained glass windows, the proportions of the columns, the symbolism of the sculptures, all conveyed a deeper reality, inaccessible to those who merely knelt in prayer. The spiritual elite walked among the people but spoke a different language. This separation endured through the centuries, creating an aristocracy of hidden knowledge. The influence of the Invisible Council was so profound that it even shaped what we now refer to as science. Many of the early scientists were also mystics, alchemists, seekers of the divine through the material world. However, with the rise of rationalism, a new iteration of this Invisible Council began to assert that only what could be measured was real. Consequently, the sacred was excluded from inquiry, the spirit was divorced from nature, and science started to deny what it once sought to understand. The outcome was a new form of captivity, absolute materialism, which regards the invisible as an illusion and the spiritual as mere superstition. Once again, an elite determined what should be accepted as truth. What's truly remarkable is that this council no longer needs to convene. Its influence is woven into the very fabric of our systems. It's present in schools that teach only the surface of history. It's found in religious texts that have undergone centuries of editing. It's evident in rituals that have lost touch with their origins. It's in the fear people feel when they dare to question. It's in the shame of seeking one's own path. The machinery keeps turning, even though its original creators have long since departed. The hidden order has fulfilled its role. It has established a self-sustaining system of spiritual disconnection, where humanity continues to search outside for what has always been within. But consciousness is stubborn. Even after generations of silence, it still awakens in some. Those who awaken feel a deep discomfort with ready-made truths, with official narratives, and with the constraints imposed on the spirit. It is these souls who begin to piece together the puzzle. They study symbols, compare translations, and investigate origins. They start to see that behind the theater of the world, there has been a meticulous performance. And perhaps the true sacred has never been lost, only hidden, waiting for eyes that know how to see. When we examine the trajectory of human civilizations, it becomes clear that religions did not emerge merely as spontaneous expressions of humanity's connection to the divine. They also served as powerful tools for social organization, psychological influence, and above all, control. Faith, that invisible thread linking humanity to the mystery of existence, was carefully channeled, transformed into structure, and institutionalized until it became a complex mechanism regulating behaviors, moralities, economies, and destinies. What begins as an inner transcendent experience soon evolves into doctrine, hierarchy, fixed rituals, and inflexible dogma. This process was not accidental, it was intentional, orchestrated by elites who realized that the soul of the people is more easily controlled when they believe there is a spiritual authority bridging them to the divine. Thus, the machinery of faith was born, one of the most effective tools of social engineering ever conceived by humanity. Since ancient civilizations, the relationship between religion and power has been deeply intertwined. Egyptian pharaohs were not just rulers, they were considered incarnations of the divine. Babylonian kings received direct orders from the heavens. Roman emperors were deified even while still alive. This direct link between spirituality and political authority established a model where questioning faith was akin to questioning the throne, and vice versa. As a result, temples became extensions of palaces, and priests served as advisors and guardians of collective morality. This fusion marked the first step toward creating a system where religious doctrines were shaped less by the pursuit of truth and more by the needs for domination and obedience. Over the centuries, this model has evolved. The institutionalization of religions allowed for the centralization of spiritual power in the hands of a select few. Positions, titles, courts, and sacred laws were established that dictated not only how to worship, but also how to dress, what to eat, whom to marry, and how to die. Faith became an invisible framework that defined every aspect of human existence. Through dogmas, notions of right and wrong were established. Through rituals, access to forgiveness and salvation was determined. Through scriptures, what constituted sin was defined, along with who would bear the consequences. All of this was legitimized by an alleged divine will, carefully interpreted by an exclusive caste of representatives of God. Christianity, upon becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire, made a monumental leap in consolidating control. The faith that emerged on the fringes of the empire, among the marginalized and persecuted, was absorbed by the state apparatus and transformed into a tool of widespread domination. Councils began to define orthodoxy, and anything that deviated from this framework was swiftly labeled as heresy. Books were removed from the Bible, concepts were banned, and the teachings of ancient masters were condemned to oblivion. The body of doctrine was shaped not by spiritual diversity, but by political convenience. Mystical spirituality was replaced by institutionalized faith, and the inner Christ was overshadowed by the figure of the external Savior, accessible only through the Church. In the Islamic world, despite its origins rooted in profound spirituality and revelation, structures emerged that channeled faith towards social regulation. The caliphates used the Quran as the foundation for Sharia, a legal system that governed every aspect of an individual's life. Sufism, the mystical and liberating expression of Islam, was consistently marginalized, monitored, and suppressed. What was once an invitation to direct communion with the divine transformed into a legal system where strict adherence to the letter of the law replaced spiritual interpretation of the word. The machinery of faith expanded, adapting to various cultures and taking on different forms, yet maintaining the same core function: to dominate hearts and minds through fear and promise. Faith became a form of currency. Indulgences, penances, offerings, vows, pilgrimages, all transformed into symbolic systems for negotiating with the divine. The faithful became spiritual debtors, always falling short, perpetually in need of redemption, and reliant on a higher authority to gain acceptance from God. The temple ceased to be a place of contemplation and turned into a counter for mediation. This structure of metaphysical debt allowed for absolute control. A person who believes that their eternal salvation hinges on blindly following rules set by an institution becomes highly manipulable. They live in fear, remain silent, and submit. This fear doesn't require constant oversight. It internalizes, operates quietly, shapes choices, suppresses desires, and constrains the will. Sexual repression is one of the most striking examples of this mechanism. By turning the body into an enemy, pleasure into guilt, and desire into sin, religions have channeled human vital energy into structures of submission. A sexually oppressed population is easier to control, more obedient, and more susceptible to promises of future salvation. By condemning the flesh, humanity's nature was condemned as well. Faith ceased to uplift the spirit and instead began to suppress the essence of being. This strategy not only distanced people from themselves, but also from nature and the feminine, elements that have always been legitimate channels of spirituality in ancestral traditions. The feminine figure, once a symbol of wisdom, intuition, and cosmic fertility in ancient cultures, has been systematically demonized. God became exclusively male. The sacred feminine was purged from ecclesiastical texts. Goddesses were transformed into witches. Priestesses were reduced to prostitutes. Any woman who dared to speak with spiritual authority was silenced, excommunicated, or burned at the stake. This was not merely cultural misogyny, it was a strategy of control. By suppressing the feminine, half of the divine expression in the world was stifled. Faith turned vertical, rational, authoritarian, and rigid. The flow, receptivity, and contemplation were lost. The machinery of faith operated as a system of permanent exclusion of gender, class, and consciousness. The machine of faith also governed time. Religious calendars began to dictate the cycles of life, workdays, fasting periods, and permitted celebrations. Spiritual time was separated from natural time. The seasons, lunar cycles, solstices, and equinoxes, once the foundation of ancestral spiritual practices, were replaced by artificial dates, often disconnected from cosmic rhythms. This severed humanity's connection to the earth, the sky, and even to themselves. Spirituality ceased to be experienced through the body and nature, becoming instead regulated by sacred agendas imposed from above. Time, one of the last natural freedoms, was transformed into a tool for spiritual control. The machinery of faith extended far beyond the realm of religion. It infiltrated politics, economics, and education. Kings and popes forged alliances, exchanged blessings for armies, and legitimized wars and colonization with sacred arguments. Religious missions accompanied conquering armies, bringing crosses alongside swords and Bibles alongside cannons. Entire nations were forcibly converted, their traditions erased, languages extinguished, and deities demonized, all in the name of a single truth. Faith became a justification for oppression, a banner for exploitation, and a rationale for slavery. Tragically, the oppressed, believing they were being saved, often collaborated with their own oppressors. The major religions, upon becoming institutionalized, inherited the structures of the empires that embraced them. Temples transformed into fortresses. Scriptures became laws. Priests turned into judges. The divine was confined to formulas, and the sacred was locked away in documents. The fear of making mistakes replaced the love for mystery. Ritualistic repetition took the place of mystical experience. Faith ceased to be a flame and turned to ash. The machinery of faith operated with precise efficiency. It indoctrinated from childhood, criminalized dissent, rewarded obedience, and punished questioning. And the people, generation after generation, learned to call this confinement salvation. But even the most well-oiled machine can't prevent doubt from creeping in. Amidst the routine of dogmas, some souls began to feel a sense of emptiness. They started to search. Intuition whispered that there was more to it, that something was missing, that the sacred couldn't be reduced to mere obedience. These souls began to read on their own, to listen to different voices, to study ancient languages, and to explore forgotten traditions. Gradually, they uncovered a quiet path hidden behind the machinery of faith, the path of the free spirit, which has never been fully tamed. A spirit that pulses in the margins of history, waiting to be rediscovered by those brave enough to look beyond the gears. In the construction of the grand religious narratives that shaped empires and consciousness, one of the most powerful yet subtle strategies was the surgical selection of what should be remembered and, crucially, what should be forgotten. Each scripture, officially accepted as divine word carries within its silence the stifled memory of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of other texts, gospels, letters, teachings, poems, and spiritual accounts that were rejected, erased, suppressed, and labeled as apocryphal. These lost writings, cut off or marginalized, create a spiritual underground that has rarely been accessed by the majority of humanity. When spirit turned into dogma, knowledge ceased to flow like a river and became a stagnant lake. And within that reservoir, what was removed was far from irrelevant. It was precisely what had the potential to awaken, question, and liberate. The formation of religious canons, particularly within Christianity, was a slow, political, and highly contested process. The councils that decided which books would be included in the Bible, such as those at Nicaea, Hippo, and Carthage, did not convene in a spirit of spiritual neutrality. Rather, they operated under intense pressure from emperors, theologians, and various strategic interests. Gospels that spoke of inner divinity, the presence of God in the human heart, the equality of men and women, and the possibility of direct communion with the divine were deliberately excluded. Writings like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, the Acts of John, the Gospel of the Egyptians, and many others contained messages that threatened the hierarchical foundations of institutional faith. They did not align with the interests of power, and as a result, they were buried under the weight of heresy. These texts, long thought to be lost, began to resurface only in the 20th century, notably with the discovery of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts in Egypt in 1945. Buried for centuries, possibly hidden by dissenting monks or persecuted Gnostics, these scrolls unveiled a radically different perspective on Christianity than the one officially taught. Instead of a singular, distant Messiah, the Gnostic texts spoke of an inner Christ, emphasizing a personal and transformative knowledge that didn't rely on temples, priests, or formal structures. At the heart of the message was gnosis, the experiential knowledge of the divine, not blind faith or obedience to the clergy. This approach decentralized spiritual power, placing the responsibility for individual awakening in the hands of each person. Such a shift was unacceptable to an institution that sought to mediate the relationship between humanity and God. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, for instance, is a hidden gem overlooked by tradition. In it, Mary is not depicted as a repentant sinner, but rather as Jesus' closest disciple, someone who truly understood his teachings and held the authority to instruct the other apostles. The feminine perspective presented in this text, characterized by intuition, love, and directness, stood in stark contrast to the patriarchal structure of the early church. Acknowledging Mary as a spiritual leader would have opened the door for the sacred feminine within doctrine, a notion that has been systematically resisted throughout the centuries. Her exclusion was not accidental, it was symbolic. By erasing Mary Magdalene, the possibility of women being bearers of the divine word was also erased. Another example is the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus that lacks historical narrative, miracles, or resurrection. It consists solely of words, deep, symbolic, and challenging. In this text, Jesus doesn't speak as an external savior, but as a teacher inviting us to seek within. If your guide says to you, "The kingdom is in heaven," then the birds of heaven will precede you. If he says, "It is in the sea," then the fish will precede you. The kingdom is within you and outside you. Such a statement undermines the authority of temples and elevates the inner sanctuary. How could this message be tolerated within a structure that demanded priestly mediation for forgiveness and salvation? The answer was straightforward: exclusion, concealment, denial. This logic wasn't confined to Christianity. In Judaism as well, many texts were discarded. The Book of Enoch, for instance, was widely read and revered in the early centuries before the Common Era. It contains accounts of the fallen angels, the Watchers, and a vast spiritual cosmology that directly influenced apocalyptic imagery and celestial hierarchies. However, for theological and political reasons, it was removed from the Jewish canon and has only remained in Ethiopian tradition. The Book of Jubilees, the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, and various intertestamental writings were all banned from the dominant tradition, labeled as dangerous or uninspired. Behind this selection process, the same criterion always applied: to preserve a singular, cohesive, unquestionable narrative centered around recognized authorities. Even outside the Judeo-Christian framework, this pattern persisted. In Hinduism, the Upanishads, profound philosophical texts discussing the union of Atman with Brahman, were for centuries confined to the realm of the Brahmins, inaccessible to the general populace. In Islam, Sufi writings that conveyed elevated states of consciousness and mystical union with the divine faced censorship, opposition, and, in some instances, destruction. The poetry of mystics like Rumi and al-Hallaj survived on the fringes of the dominant system, passed down more through oral tradition and heartfelt connection than through institutional endorsement. Living spirituality has always been perceived as a threat by stagnant structures. Consequently, texts that embodied this vitality were often silenced. The transformation of spirit into dogma also led to the entrenchment of mystery within rigid formulas. What was once poetry became legal prose. Experiences were reduced to doctrine. Parables were turned into rules. Interpretative freedom gave way to theological rigidity. Metaphors were taken literally. As a result, teachings that were deeply symbolic began to be viewed as historical truths or moral imperatives. For instance, hell, which was often a metaphor for inner states of spiritual alienation in many ancient texts, was reinterpreted as a physical place of eternal torment, designed to instill fear and submission. The same happened with concepts like sin, heaven, salvation, and judgment. Everything was hardened to serve a framework of behavioral and political control. Over time, people forgot that these excluded texts ever existed. The silence became so profound that only scholars or those in the know dared to question it. Even they often faced persecution, censorship, or exile. Accessing what had been cut was viewed as a deviation, a betrayal, or spiritual rebellion. Formal education never taught about the lost gospels or the books that were left out of the canon. Religious publishers never printed these texts. Thus, forgetting became institutionalized. What wasn't read wasn't lived, and what wasn't lived was deemed non-existent. But the memory of the spirit runs deeper than the archives of history. Even without the words to express it, many felt that something was missing. They sensed that the religious experience offered to them was shallow, limited, and mechanical. They felt that the promise of salvation did not fill the void within. This feeling, present in countless souls throughout the centuries, echoed the lost texts, the unspoken words, and the denied truths. It was the call of the living sacred, which resists being confined to authorized pages. And it was this call that led archaeologists, researchers, mystics, and seekers to excavate ruins, decipher manuscripts, study dead languages, and rediscover the fragments of the spirit that had been left behind. Today, with access to these rediscovered texts, we have the chance to revisit spirituality with fresh eyes, not as a break from tradition, but as a reconnection with the original source. As we read what has been erased, we begin to realize that the spirit was never meant to be confined to dogma, that truth cannot be contained within a closed book, and that the divine cannot be boxed in by councils. Perhaps the greatest sin was not disobeying a rule, but forgetting who we truly are. The return to the excluded texts is not an act of rebellion, it is a reminder that the sacred transcends any doctrine, and that the spirit does not bow to censorship. It simply waits patiently for the moment of reunion. As religious institutions solidified their authority, wielding iron fists and forming imperial alliances to dictate what would be remembered and what would be buried, a parallel movement quietly emerged, almost unnoticed. This was a silent effort to safeguard the deepest truths of human spirituality from censorship and manipulation. These were the guardians of the unseen. Initiates from ancient schools, exiled mystics, hidden masters, and spiritual alchemists, recognizing the closing of the sacred doors, chose to keep a flame alive in realms untouched by the gaze of institutional power. The human soul, universal symbols, the codes of nature, and the cosmic cycles. They established orders, circles, and brotherhoods that spanned centuries, often persecuted, frequently distorted, but always maintaining an invisible thread that connects the present to ancestral wisdom. These societies didn't emerge all at once or from a single source. They are fragments of a memory that stretches back long before official religions. to times when spiritual knowledge was passed down quietly, in caves, in deserts, from the eyes of a master to a disciple. The Essenes, for instance, are often cited as one of these orders, a community that lived in seclusion, embodying profound purity while safeguarding the secrets of the spirit, healing, astrology, lunar cycles, the practice of silence, and a direct connection to the divine. Their writings were hidden away and only resurfaced in recent times. Yet, they were not alone. History is filled with parallel orders: the Pythagoreans, the Egyptian therapists, the Manichaeans, wandering Sufis, the Rosicrucians, the Cathars, the Templars, and later, the Freemasons and the Illuminati, each one a piece of a hidden puzzle, holding a key, a part of the map to the forgotten sacred. These societies understood that spiritual knowledge couldn't be given all at once. It was like fire, and fire shouldn't be handed to someone still surrounded by dry straw. That's why their teachings were delivered in layers, through symbols, parables, rituals, and stages of initiation. There was no clear line between teacher and student. Instead, there was a ladder of inner evolution, where each step required genuine transformation. They recognized that truth isn't something you simply hear, it's something you become. For this reason, they preferred concealment over trivialization. It was better to hide than to desecrate, better to preserve than to simplify. Thus, throughout the ages, even in the face of brutal persecution, they managed to pass down a legacy that no empire could completely erase. Freemasonry, for instance, while much more modern than its predecessors, is a direct heir to this tradition of codifying spiritual knowledge. Its ceremonies, symbols, hierarchical structures, and rites of passage were not created by chance. Every tool, gesture, and word carries a dual meaning, one that is external and visible to all, and another that is internal, understood only by those who have undergone true initiation, which is not merely the external ceremony, but a transformation of consciousness. The trowel, compass, square, all-seeing eye, and pillars, these are all ancient archetypes, predating Freemasonry itself, drawn from the mystery schools of Egypt, Chaldea, Greece, and even older cultures, perhaps even pre-Diluvian ones. These symbols are not just decorative, they serve as spiritual activation devices, encrypted maps of the human interior and its journey toward the divine. The Rosicrucians emerged as a secret order of alchemists and thinkers who claimed to be the guardians of forgotten wisdom, passed down since ancient times and subtly reintroduced to those capable of seeing beyond mere words. Their public expressions were enigmatic, filled with metaphors, allegories, and symbolic language. They spoke of the transmutation of lead into gold, but this gold was not material. It represented the awakened soul, the purified spirit. In an era of rigid dogmas and witch hunts, these groups safeguarded their ideas in coded manuscripts, using the languages of art, music, geometry, and poetry to convey truths that would never be accepted from the pulpits or courts of official faith. Other groups were even more secretive, such as the medieval alchemists, who toiled away in hidden basements, libraries, and forests, studying not just the elements of nature, but also the states of the soul. For them, the philosopher's stone was more than just a legend. It symbolized inner integration, the union of opposites, and the revelation of the eternal spirit that resides within the mortal body. External transmutation was merely a reflection of internal transformation. Many of these alchemists faced persecution, branded as charlatans or sorcerers, yet their works have endured in codes, seals, poetic formulas, and allegorical figures that continue to intrigue and inspire those who seek truth beyond the surface. And even more subtly, there were the masters of the East, guardians of ancient traditions such as Taoism, Tantra, Tantric Buddhism, Dzogchen, Sufism, and Esoteric Kabbalah. These lineages have kept the direct experience of the divine alive through meditation, silence, breathwork, conscious movement, chanting mantras, and visualizing sacred mandalas. Despite invasions, destruction, and censorship, they managed to preserve the essence of living spiritual experience, often passed down orally from master to disciple, never relying on formal structures or official recognition. They understood that the flame of the spirit doesn't need stone temples, but rather prepared bodies and passionate hearts. The secret to their survival lay in anonymity and decentralization. They weren't mass movements. They were movements of consciousness. They sought not temples, but receptive souls. Public recognition didn't matter to them. What mattered was the preservation of the sacred. When pursued, they vanished. When forgotten, they re-emerged. Their strength came not from numbers, but from the vibrational quality of their legacy. Each symbol carried millennia of meaning. Each ritual served as a bridge between worlds. Each teaching held infinite layers. And so, even in times of spiritual darkness, their subtle light never completely extinguished. It remained alive somewhere, in the dreams of a seeker, in the margins of a manuscript, in the silent gaze of an old master. However, over time, these societies also became targets of infiltration, distortion, and trivialization. Some were corrupted by political interests, while others were romanticized to the point of losing their initiatory rigor. Many have turned into caricatures of their former selves, yet what remains of them is still valuable. Their symbols continue to speak, their ideas still resonate, their methods remain effective, because true spiritual knowledge is timeless. It can be obscured, distorted, or forgotten, but it can never be destroyed. It is woven into the very fabric of the universe, in the natural laws, and in the cycles of life. The guardians of the unseen understood this. They didn't protect a dogma. They safeguarded a vibration, a primordial sound, a memory that, once awakened, can never be lost. Today, as we revisit these orders and societies, we must avoid falling into a superficial mystical fascination, nor should we judge them through the lens of modern reason. Instead, we should listen with an attentive heart, recognizing their effort to preserve something that transcends religions, cultures, languages, and eras. We need to acknowledge that thanks to these invisible guardians, we still have access to fragments of the sacred that have slipped from the grasp of those in power. These fragments, if wisely united, can help us reconstruct the lost map of the human soul. For what they have always safeguarded is not just any secret. It is the reminder that we are part of the divine, and that the greatest initiation of all is to remember who we truly are. Emerging from the silent depths of esoteric orders and guardians of the unseen, we are inevitably confronted with one of the most brutal and systematic forces ever unleashed against the freedom of the human spirit: the Inquisition. But those who believe it was merely about burning witches at medieval stakes or cold interrogations conducted by hooded monks are mistaken. The Inquisition was, above all, a profound mechanism of psychological and emotional engineering, a carefully crafted system designed to suppress any flicker of free thought, any spark of inquiry, any direct experience of the divine that did not pass through the official channels of dogma. It didn't just hunt down bodies, it mutilated minds. And its scars are not confined to the past. They continue to shape the way society thinks, believes, obeys, and, most importantly, fears. The birth of the Inquisition formalized what had already been happening covertly: the institutionalized fear used as a tool for spiritual domination. Officially established in the 13th century by the Catholic Church, the Inquisition aimed to combat heresies, essentially any ideas that deviated from the established doctrine. However, its true purpose was much broader. It served as an instrument of ideological purification, social control, and the silencing of spiritual traditions that threatened centralized authority. The Cathars, for instance, were among the first targets of the Inquisition's wrath. They lived in the south of France and preached a spirituality rooted in simplicity, purity, and direct contact with the divine. They rejected papal authority, questioned the corruption of the clergy, and spoke openly about the duality of the world. They were brutally massacred in a bloody crusade, and their memory was meticulously erased. It wasn't just the doctrinal differences that were troubling, it was the spiritual autonomy. Free thought, mystical intuition, ancestral wisdom, a connection to nature, herbal medicine, ancient rituals, and inner listening. All of this was branded as witchcraft, paganism, sorcery, and heresy. Being accused of such crimes was not merely a theological issue, it was a slow, painful, and public death sentence. The Inquisition didn't require concrete evidence. Mere suspicion, an anonymous tip, or unusual behavior was enough. Someone who healed with plants, read the stars, meditated in silence, or claimed to have dreamed of the divine could easily find themselves reported. And once accused, escape was nearly impossible. Guilt was assumed, torture was justified, and confession was inevitable. The inquisitorial chambers were true laboratories of psychological terror. Through pain, fear, humiliation, and isolation, the Inquisition aimed not only to extract confessions but to obliterate the spiritual identity of the individual. The body was brutalized, but the true goal was to kill the spirit, and it wasn't just the accused who suffered. The entire community was targeted. Public executions served as a form of pedagogical theater. They taught the people to fear, to remain silent, and to obey. This was not merely about eliminating a heretic, it was about demonstrating that thinking differently was dangerous. In this way, fear spread like a virus, infiltrating homes, families, and traditions, silencing voices even before they could be heard. This fear has persisted long after the formal abolition of inquisitorial courts. It has seeped into educational systems, church sermons, political speeches, and family conversations. It has become internalized. How many people today unknowingly carry the fear of connecting with their intuition, exploring ancestral traditions, questioning dogmas, or seeking answers within themselves that have been forbidden for centuries? The repression was so effective that often the victim became the warden of their own prison. We dismiss ancient wisdom as mere superstition. We lose faith in the power of symbols, rituals, nature, and meditation. What was once a celebration is now labeled as sin. In doing so, we perpetuate the inquisitorial mindset without the need for torturers. We become our own internal inquisitors. However, the Inquisition was not an exclusively Christian phenomenon. Throughout history, various religions and political systems have employed similar strategies to control thought and spirituality. The Ottoman Empire persecuted Sufi sects that dared to challenge the official interpretation of Islam. Rabbinic Judaism targeted mystical movements like Sabbateanism and suppressed the spread of Kabbalistic ideas during many periods. In the modern world, extreme rationalism and dogmatic scientism have also taken on the role of inquisitors, ridiculing, censoring, and excluding any spiritual approach that doesn't conform to the standards of academic materialism. The form may have changed, but the essence remains the same, denying individuals the right to think, feel, and experience the sacred on their own terms. Spiritual censorship has taken many forms. It wasn't just about the destruction of books. It also involved the rewriting of history. Many great mystical thinkers have been erased from curricula, banned from libraries, and omitted from sermons. How many people are familiar with the teachings of Meister Eckhart, the Christian mystic who spoke of the divine spark within humanity and faced persecution for it? Or Hildegard of Bingen, the visionary and healer whose insights were systematically tamed by theology? And what about Giordano Bruno, who dared to claim that the universe was infinite and inhabited by higher intelligences, and was burned alive for it? The Inquisition didn't just kill bodies, it killed ideas, and in killing ideas, it extinguished possibilities. The repression of free thought wasn't limited to prominent figures. It affected entire communities. Indigenous peoples, for instance, became targets of missionary campaigns aimed at eradicating their belief systems, rituals, sacred languages, and worldviews. They were labeled as primitive, pagan, and demonic. Their spiritual leaders were persecuted, shamans were killed, their songs were banned, and their traditional medicines were criminalized. The Inquisition extended its reach through colonization, disguised as evangelization, bringing not just crosses but also the invisible shackles of forced conversion. As a result, a significant part of humanity's oldest and deepest spiritual knowledge was condemned to silence. This process of censorship and repression aimed not only to silence the past but also to shape the future. By uprooting the foundations, growth could be controlled. By burning books, horizons were erased. By punishing free thinkers, collective imagination was stifled. A society that cannot envision alternatives to the dominant system is doomed to repeat itself. And that's precisely what the Spiritual Inquisition achieved for centuries. It turned fear into routine, ignorance into virtue, and submission into devotion. The cost was staggering. Entire generations grew up without access to humanity's mystical legacy, unaware that there are other paths, other ways to experience the sacred, to understand the universe, and to be free. However, not everything has been silenced forever. The human spirit is stubborn. It endures, even beneath the ashes. Throughout history, there have always been those who dared to remember, those who listened to the inner voice that rang louder than the cries of power, those who challenged dogmas, fully aware of the cost. These individuals, often anonymous, kept the flame of free thought alive, the quest for inner truth and the direct connection to the divine. They are proof that consciousness cannot be extinguished, that the spirit does not bow down, that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually blossom. And now, in this time when so many structures are crumbling, these truths are resurfacing. Because while the Inquisition may have won battles, it has never triumphed in the war of the human soul against the forgetfulness of self. After centuries of repression, censorship, distortions, and calculated erasure of ancestral wisdom, a moment arrived in history when cracks began to appear in the foundations of the official narrative. The once thick and untouchable veil could no longer contain the rising force of collective intuition that pulsed in the shadows of the dominant culture. And just like everything in nature that is suppressed for too long, the sacred truths started to seep through the cracks of institutional rigidity, the crevices of dogma, and the margins of educational and scientific systems. This awakening didn't occur in a single moment or through a specific leader. It has been and continues to be a spontaneous, chaotic, and inevitable force that emerges from within, a subterranean current that shattered the false notion that spirituality belongs to a select few. With this awakening also came a rupture, a deep divide between what was taught and what was truly felt, between obedience and freedom, between fear and the call of the heart. During the European Renaissance, something profound changed. It wasn't merely an artistic movement or a rediscovery of Greco-Roman culture. It marked a new awakening of the human spirit, a tentative return to the right to seek knowledge independently, to think beyond imposed boundaries, and to view the universe through one's own eyes. Influential figures like Giordano Bruno, Marsilio Ficino, Paracelso, Pico della Mirandola, and many others began to break free from the linear and dogmatic worldview. Hermetic philosophy re-emerged from the shadows, nurturing the idea that humanity is a microcosm of the macrocosm, a living reflection of the divine. Ancient texts, once hidden away, started to be translated. The Kabbalah emerged from silence. The Corpus Hermeticum found its readers. Alchemy was once again a topic of discussion. Astrology was lifted from the realm of witchcraft and placed within the context of cosmic study. For the first time in centuries, spirituality began to breathe anew. This new wave also had a direct impact on the birth of modern sciences. Contrary to what school textbooks often suggest, the early scientists were not adversaries of spirituality. On the contrary, many of them were alchemists, esotericists, and nature scholars who viewed the natural world as a manifestation of the divine. Isaac Newton, for instance, studied alchemical and biblical texts with the same fervor he applied to physics. Kepler, Galileo, and Descartes all navigated between two realms: the visible and the invisible, the rational and the symbolic. They still held the belief that uncovering the laws of the universe was, at its core, a way to reveal the mind of God. However, over time, this unifying perspective was overshadowed by a new kind of dogma, absolute rationalism, which severed ties with the mystical and established a new inquisition, one that recognized matter as the only legitimate reality. However, the seed of awakening had already been sown. The following centuries saw a growing number of individuals who, dissatisfied with the superficiality of doctrine and the coldness of reason, turned inward. Spiritual exploration became increasingly individualized, less reliant on institutions and more connected to direct experiences. In the 19th century, esoteric movements like the Theosophical Society, led by Helena Blavatsky, reignited interest in Eastern traditions, Egyptian mysteries, Indian philosophy, occultism, and the concept of the essential unity of all religions. The notion that there was a primordial wisdom existing before dogmas began to take hold. Spirituality evolved from mere belief into a profound investigation of the self. At the same time, there was a revival of the feminine in the sacred. Female writers, mystics, priestesses, and therapists began to reclaim the forgotten memory of the goddess. The matriarchal traditions, the lunar cycles, and the feminine archetypes. The repression of the sacred feminine was starting to unravel. Women reclaimed their roles as spiritual guides, healers, and interpreters of the unseen. Women's circles, ancestral dances, earth rituals, and lunar wisdom began to thrive once more. This resurgence was not in opposition to the masculine, but rather as a complement. The sacred shifted from a vertical hierarchy to a circular flow. The break from the patriarchal model created space for a return to an integrative, inclusive, organic, and vibrant spirituality. At the same time, advancements in modern physics began to fracture the materialistic framework of reality. Quantum physics unveiled a universe filled with uncertainties, invisible fields, particles behaving like waves, non-local connections, and observers influencing outcomes. Concepts that echoed ancient spiritual teachings started to be discussed in universities. Science, unwittingly, was rediscovering mystery. The divide between mind and matter, spirit and body, visible and invisible, was beginning to reveal itself as artificial. The mechanistic paradigm, which had dominated for centuries, was collapsing in the face of a cosmos that didn't adhere to its rules. It was as if reality was finally confessing, there is something beyond logic. The 20th century witnessed a surge in self-discovery movements. The rise of depth psychology, particularly through Jung, brought archetypes, myths, symbols, and dreams to the forefront as gateways to the collective unconscious and, by extension, to the sacred. Meditation transcended monasteries and found its way into homes. Yoga emerged as a global practice. Shamanism regained respect as a legitimate path to healing. Once banned books began circulating freely. Indigenous, African, Eastern, and Romani ancestral knowledge started to be appreciated for its spiritual wealth. Spirituality evolved into a vibrant, adaptable, and multifaceted pursuit, moving away from institutional control and drawing closer to the individual's real experience. Technology, once seen as the enemy of the spirit, has now begun to aid in awakening. For the first time in history, millions of people gained instant access to information that was previously reserved for the elite. Digitized manuscripts, lectures, documentaries, forums, rare books, everything is just a click away. The barrier to knowledge has been dismantled. The structures that upheld the monopoly on interpretation have crumbled. Now everyone has the opportunity to become a seeker, a researcher, a questioner. With this opportunity comes increased responsibility. Awakening can no longer be outsourced. The call is now direct, non-transferable, and undeniable. More and more, crowds are responding to this silent call. What has truly been shattered is the illusion that the sacred belongs to just a select few. That truth is exclusive. That spiritual experiences must be filtered through external sources. The veil, woven over millennia of control, has begun to unravel. And behind it, many have found not a new dogma, but silence. An inner space where the divine doesn't require credentials, where wisdom has no owner, and where truth is a vibration, not a text. This rupture, therefore, is not against religions, science, or systems. It is against forgetfulness, against lies, against the imprisonment of the soul, and in favor of remembrance, of freedom, of a direct connection to the mystery that pulses through everything. Today, this awakening movement expresses itself in diverse ways. People are leaving behind traditions that no longer resonate, reclaiming forgotten knowledge, rewriting their beliefs, reinventing rituals, and forming communities centered around healing, meditation, contemplation, and reconnection. There is no longer a single path. Instead, there are multiple roads converging at the center. The spirit, once confined, now breathes in public squares, forests, therapy rooms, virtual communities, festivals, discussion circles, and silent retreats. This break was not destruction. It was revelation. The veil has lifted. And behind it lies what has always been present, yet many have never dared to confront: the sacred in its purest form, free, wild, intimate, and alive. After navigating through the shadows of concealment, the silent corridors of secret temples, the decisions of unseen councils, the surgical cuts of doctrine, and the bonfires of repression, we finally arrive at the most sensitive and powerful point of this entire journey: the reconnection with what has never truly been hidden, but merely dormant, the sacred within us. This is the knowledge that no empire has ever managed to erase, that no censorship has been able to silence, and that no doctrine could monopolize. It resides not in external words, but in the silent vibration that pulses at the core of our being. It is found in our cells, in our breath, in our dreams, in spontaneous gestures of compassion, in the persistent intuition, and in the truth that resonates without explanation. The ultimate secret is not a lost book, a hidden symbol, or a forbidden ritual. It is the remembrance that the divine is accessed not from the outside, but from within. This truth, which so many ancient cultures have proclaimed with ease and which numerous systems have tried to suppress, is too simple for a mind shaped by centuries of spiritual hierarchy to accept. How can we embrace the idea that what we seek in temples, from gurus, in scriptures, and through rituals already exists within every heartbeat? How can we acknowledge that paradise isn't a distant place, but rather a state of presence? How do we confront the reality that the kingdom of heaven, as Jesus spoke of in the hidden Gospels, isn't found in temples built by human hands, but in the inner space from which consciousness emerges? The sacred isn't something to be conquered, it's something to be awakened. Perhaps that's why it has been so threatening to those who profit from spiritual alienation. An awakened human being is ungovernable, incorruptible, and uncontrollable. They are already whole, already free, already divine. This inner knowledge, which is now beginning to emerge more strongly, has always revealed itself during the most intense moments of human life. At birth, in death, in profound love, in extreme pain, in the contemplation of nature, and in absolute silence. These are the moments when the rational mind quiets down and presence takes over. In these instances, we feel something that defies explanation, yet is undeniable. An expansion, a connection, a certainty of belonging. This is the living sacred, the pulse that exists before any interpretation. It is from this place that we can rebuild a spirituality no longer rooted in control, but in remembrance. No longer based in fear, but in presence. No longer imposed, but chosen. Returning to this inner spirituality doesn't require escaping the world or isolating oneself in caves. Instead, it demands the courage to quiet the external noise and listen to the soft whispers that have always been there. It calls for a willingness to unlearn, to question, and to shed the layers imposed by traditions that, at some point, lost touch with their source. It requires surrendering to the fertile void where truth reveals itself effortlessly. Above all, it demands humility, not in the face of external authorities, but before the mystery itself. Humility to acknowledge that we don't know everything, that there's no one-size-fits-all formula, and that each path is unique. Because the divine doesn't repeat itself. It reinvents in every being, in every breath, in every act of awareness. This new spiritual awareness emerging in the world is a quiet revolution. It doesn't march through the streets. Instead, it transforms through example. It doesn't impose, it inspires. It doesn't exclude, it embraces. This is a spirituality that sees God in others, in the different, in the strange, and in what may seem profane. It requires no approval, no dogma, and no authority. It manifests in our connection to the earth, our bodies, art, and the present moment. It doesn't demand perfection, but rather authenticity. It recognizes mistakes as part of the journey. It understands that evolution isn't about climbing invisible ladders away from the world, but about descending into the depths of oneself to find what has always been sought outside. This memory has practical consequences. It transforms relationships, purposes, choices, and priorities. A person who recognizes the sacred within themselves no longer feels the need to compete, compare, or dominate. Instead, they cooperate, they listen, they show respect. They serve, they see value where they once perceived a threat. They recognize the other as a mirror rather than an enemy. This is the true revolution, the shift from power over to power with, from control to presence, from external authority to internal sovereignty. The world changes when our perspective changes, and our perspective shifts when our consciousness remembers who we truly are. Even amidst the apparent chaos of the modern world, ecological crises, social collapses, extreme polarization, this awakening continues to grow. It's as if every external disintegration is creating space for internal reintegration. Each crisis serves as an invitation to realign. Every collapse offers a chance for rebirth. The old world must crumble for the new to emerge. And this new world won't be built solely on technology. It will be founded on awareness, wisdom, spirit, and a remembrance of what truly matters. What is emerging now isn't a new religion, but a new way of being human, more whole, more connected, and more authentic. However, it's important to remember that this process of awakening is neither linear nor comfortable. It requires us to navigate through layers of pain, conditioning, and resistance. It demands that we confront our shadows, face our fears, and address the guilt inherited from centuries of spiritual repression. It calls for forgiveness, even towards the structures that have harmed us, not to condone their actions, but to free ourselves from the prison of anger and victimhood. In this context, forgiveness becomes a revolutionary act of sovereignty. It's the moment we stop blaming the past and take ownership of the present. It's when we cease to seek saviors and instead become responsible for our own light. It's when we transition from being followers to becoming co-creators. The knowledge we are still awakening to will not be handed down by enlightened masters. Rather, it will emerge from deep listening. It won't be found in official texts, but revealed in moments of quiet clarity. It won't be proclaimed with trumpets, but will arise in the simplicity of the present moment. This is the time to reclaim our inner authority, to embody spirituality, to find the sacred in the everyday. It's about transforming ordinary life into a ritual, work into service, food into an offering, the body into a temple, breath into prayer, and presence into an altar. Because what was once separated is now coming together. What was fragmented is now being integrated. What was hidden is now being remembered. Even though there are still resistances and decaying structures trying to maintain control, echoes of old fears reverberating in authoritarian rhetoric, the awakening is already irreversible. Not because everyone is aware, but because the process has begun. What awakens in one person ignites a spark in many. The morphogenetic field of consciousness is expanding. The collective vibration is rising. The invisible is becoming tangible. What once seemed unattainable is now becoming familiar. The return to the sacred won't be announced in headlines or proclaimed by institutions. It will be felt, lived, embodied. Like a song playing softly in the background that, little by little, everyone starts to remember how to dance to. The order of the shadows of the sacred has long tried to dictate what the people should never know. But time has shown us that true power lies not in concealment, but in remembrance. We are now living in an age of recollection, a time of return, a reappropriation of the soul. The veil has been lifted, and now, the sacred that has always resided within us is finally beginning to be embraced. Not as doctrine, but as presence. Not as promise, but as reality. And this changes everything, because a world where the sacred dwells within every human being is a world where the impossible no longer exists. Where the divine is not above or outside, but within, whole, alive, awakened in us. Now that you've traveled this journey with us, share in the comments. Which part of this story resonated with you the most? What deep down did you feel you always knew, but just needed to be reminded of? Your response might inspire others too. We are co-creating this space of conscious manifestation together, Mind Unfettered. Every word you share here vibrates and resonates with fellow seekers around the globe. Shall we build this collective remembrance? Share your truth here. If this video has opened a door within you, then the next one is a portal. Click on your screen now and watch The Book of 33 Steps, the hidden map Jesus left for enlightenment, where we unveil the secret map left by the one who came to remind us of the divine within. We found ourselves there, free-spirited,